Hello all, Rick here with a Starship Lore breakdown, and this is a vessel I didn't think much of until I really started to take a look. The Nimitz class cruiser. The Nimitz design was known to be a flagship from its first draft. It was to show up, look like the part of a heroic and powerful vessel, capable of, quote, saving the day. Although this was all designer John Eaves had to go on for this particular brief. By this stage, concept work of Discovery was well underway, so there was a portfolio of alternate concepts already available. Eaves decided to make the vessel look more rugged and militaristic by taking slices out of the saucer, breaking up that more serene primary hull and adding edges. This also adds an ideal place to house additional weapons systems. The initial concept had 3 torpedo launchers in each recess and an additional on the roll bar. However, the final design had some last-minute tweaks made to the bridge module being moved to the top of the ship, and the 3 launchers turned into 4. I'm currently also working on a video covering this in-universe era of Starfleet Design 2, but in the meantime let's break down the lore of the Nimitz class. It began development during the fleet revitalization project known as Operation Next Step. In the decades following the formation of the United Federation of Planets, newer technologies were implemented from a variety of worlds, leading to a needed overhaul of Starship design philosophy. With a flurry of designs and new interactions being uncovered every other day, not every schematic made it past the design phase, and the Nimitz started as one of these. Initially designed as a powerful, armed vessel made for protecting the frontier of UFP space, instead Starfleet sidelined it in favour of deep space exploration ships and more conservative patrol and defence escorts. It was not until the mid-2230s that rising Klingon tension and Kzinti raids that Starfleet began to consider such a class again. While not the last vessel to come from the files of Next Step, it saw that era of design maintained into the mid-23rd century. New systems and refinements had been derived since the project's initial concept, so these were introduced over 16 months into what would become the Nimitz class cruiser. It essentially had 2 functions, both focused on securing the frontiers against aggression. The first was to operate as a patrol and deterrent, and the second role was to act as a command hub for the Admiralty when they were needed on the front lines. A therefore ideal mission for this class was to have it act as a diplomatic envoy during wartime, protecting its transitory flag officers and providing uninterrupted communications and hopefully acting as a deterrent against attack. It's a flying castle. Thanks to the intensive design process, however, it was not quick to create, so only a limited number were ever built from the main shipyard sites of San Francisco Orbital, the Elysium fields over Mars, which was the precursor to Utopia Planitia, Andor's Imperial shipyards, and the warp engines were created at the Yoyodyne Propulsion Systems of Proxima. The prototype of the class was launched in 2235, and the line was to be named after admirals of the Federation history, ships of the Second World War, and moons. The class continued to serve in various skirmishes and wars until 2265, when the line was decommissioned after Tholian aggression subsided, as these ships' complex systems required a lot of time and resources to maintain. Occasionally, remaining ships were returned to service, but most were dismantled by 2300. One nice detail is, much like the Walker class, the Nimitz has an unconventional bridge placement. Instead of being on the centre of the primary hull, it was on a tower between the upper pylons. This reminds me more of a traditional naval vessel placement, even if it is more exposed, but that's kind of been a consistent problem with Star Trek ships. This contained dedicated command and communications systems. The ship was 383 metres long, which made it 252 wide and 74 tall. It looks to have an estimated 20 decks, with the command tower adding substantially to this number. For warp systems, it looks like it had 4 warp nacelles, but technically, no. The 2 underslung nacelles were what you would expect, but the upper structures did indeed carry warp coils, but were not active warp field generators. Instead, they acted to amplify and sustain the warp field generated below, easing the burden of FTL flight once it got going. So it continues Starfleet's experimentation with quad nacelle ships, but they hadn't quite hit the nail on the head yet. Additionally, these effectively operated as subspace amplifiers, and therefore could be tied into the communications systems or a number of other subspace penetrating devices to act as signal and range boosters. This is something that, in later designs, it would be more of a deflector dish job. But again, this is a ship from a time when Starfleet was going wild with ideas and seeing what stuck. It had 6 impulse outlets, and harkens from a time when they still attached impulse drives to the end of their warp nacelles, a trend which occasionally would resurface but infrequently. It also had 2 main impulse engines for power, while the other ones were for manoeuvrability, which it typically had when it was going. Armaments time! As you would expect, this class was heavily outfitted with a wide array of weaponry. However, not as many placements as the Cardenas class. It had 15 dual phaser arrays, with 7 atop the saucer and 8 under. It had 5 smaller phaser turrets, covering the remaining angles on the top, and 2 turrets rear. It also bore 4 phaser cannons, perhaps the first iteration of this concept in Starfleet, more powerful but with far more restricted fields of fire. These were placed in the recessed alcoves of the saucer next to 4 photon torpedo launchers each side. This thing had 8 forward-facing launchers and 8 rear-facing ones for a total of 16. Not as excessive as some other classes, but I've said it before and I'll say it again, phaser strips were definitely more efficient. Hey, we come in peace, don't mind the 16 torpedo launchers. Much like the Malachowski class, the Nimitz retained the elongated deflector first seen on the NX class. In terms of auxiliary craft, it had 4 shuttles in its bay, which were outfitted to act as coordinated fighter craft for defence of the vessel. The lowermost decks had large cargo bay access. Finally, and this is more of an observation than a lore thing, but the underside of the Nimitz class, well, if you were to rotate it around and look at the design, it looks far closer to an original series vessel than it does from the top angle, and I don't know, I just think that's a good design. Many within Starfleet would cite the powerful defences of the Nimitz as contributing to the defence of the Federation, assigned as they were along areas of tension like the Klingon Federation border. Unfortunately, with it being on display so heavily, it may have contributed to the tension further instead. Having such a heavily armed starship frequently paraded along the Klingon border might serve to quell them for a time, but it made Federation claims of respecting sovereignty and peaceful intention harder to believe, especially to a Klingon warrior's mindset. In some way, therefore, it probably added fuel to the fire of the Klingon War of 2256. However, if the Federation presented no defences, then the Klingon houses would likely have continued to bully and raid at their whim, so it's a lose-lose situation, really. I think it's funny that Starfleet continues to make starships that are clearly designed with combat in mind, yet refuses to call them such. Like, if this ship came out of any other interstellar power, it would be considered a battleship. But Starfleet also loads up every one of their ships with above-average sensor systems, labs and survey capabilities, so that even their would-be battleships are capable of being something else. To be fair though, I also would not have it any other way, as it stands truer to the mission goals of the Federation, and makes those rare exceptions, like the Defiant, reflective of the times. In Star Trek Online, the Vessel 2 was one of the classes repurposed from Yard 39, however, as far as I'm aware, we do not see the Europa class on screen at all, so it remains non-canonical. So, that covers my look into the Nimitz class, an early command cruiser-style vessel from Starfleet whose design actually bears a lot of little hallmarks of later ships. What do you think of this vessel? I found it surprisingly interesting, and its initial look to me was always just a background vessel with 4 nacelles, despite its prominence during initial inclusions. Thanks for watching. I've been Rick and I'll see you next time. Until then, thanks again, and goodbye.